All right, so let's conclude by taking a look at some of the theoretical perspectives on deviance. So in addition to looking at functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, we're also going to take a look at two new theories today. Since the sociology of crime became such a popular topic, there's actually a subfield, a related social science field of criminology. There's a lot of intersections between sociology and criminology, but that intersection and this real large emphasis on the study of crime has resulted in the development of a number of other theories. We're going to take a look at two other ones today as well. So functionalists see deviance as a key component of a functioning society. As always, functionalists are always concerned with how society functions as a whole, as a machine. So they're always going to look at how different mechanisms, different behaviors in society can be contributing to society and the betterment of it as a whole. Functionalists think that deviance can challenge society's views on problematic norms. So deviance can be dysfunctional in some ways. For example, Black students performing sit-ins during the civil rights movement, challenging society's norm of segregation, could be seen as something dysfunctional from a functionalist perspective because segregation itself was viewed as something that could have been beneficial or functional for society by organizing people into certain groups. Again, I've said it many times, I don't see a lot of merit in much of functionalist arguments today because they are pretty dated. Obviously, any argument that can be made supporting inequality, supporting segregation seems to be a bit ridiculous in our current society today. When deviant acts are negatively sanctioned, it reaffirms societal norms. So seeing a violent protester get arrested reminds other protesters that violence isn't always allowed, isn't allowed, and that they too could get arrested. So that's something functional about deviance, is that we know that if we go against the norms in society, right, if we engage in deviant behavior, we will likely experience some form of negative sanction, whether it's something as simple as getting a dirty look if you pick your nose versus something more serious like getting arrested for actually breaking a crime. Society learns, we socialize people that to act deviantly, to challenge the norms of society, has negative repercussions. So a functionalist suggests that, policing deviance in this way can be beneficial for society because it keeps other people from engaging in crime. So strain theory is one of those extra theories that I said we are going to kind of supplement our discussion on crime today, and it's kind of an extension of functionalism in some respects here. It takes functionalism further by additionally considering how an individual's access to socially acceptable goals play an important part in determining whether or not they will act deviantly. So think, for example, what happens when a person has a socially acceptable goal, whatever that may be, but they lack a socially acceptable means to reach that goal. What will they do? Well, strain theory essentially posits that they will do one of five things. The first option is conformity. So according to this option of conformity, individuals, when they have a particular goal in mind, something that is socially acceptable, right? For example, that I brought up here, they want to go to college, right? If an individual wants to go to college, but they don't have the socially acceptable means to reach that goal, what will they do? So the first option, according to strain theory, is conform. Individuals who conform will not deviate, they will not challenge the norms, they will not engage in deviant behavior, they will simply do the best that they can through socially acceptable means. Whether or not they achieve the goal remains undetermined, but they're not going to act deviantly, they're definitely not going to break any crimes, they're just going to do the best that they can and continue to follow society's norms, so they're going to continue to conform. Another option through strain theory is innovation. According to this perspective, when an individual has a goal, but they do not have socially acceptable means to achieve it, they'll resort to crime or deviance to pursue that goal, right? So very different from conforming. Conformists just go along with the flow, try and follow the status quo, follow normative behaviors, and just hope for the best. Innovators, on the other hand, are willing to get a little dirty, right? They're willing to be deviant or to engage in crime or to break the laws, in order to achieve this goal that they have. Third option is ritualism. Ritualists will lower their goals until they can be reached through socially acceptable ways. So maybe the main way that they plan on achieving their goal isn't attainable to them. They can't achieve it for whatever reasons. However, maybe if they lower their expectations, if they lower their goals to something that is more achievable, they could achieve in that capacity. Next, we have retreatism, and retreatist rejects society's goals altogether, and they end up withdrawing from society and from its norms. So retreatism, I think you should be able to draw a good connection to the functionalist concept of anomie that we talked about earlier in the semester, right? When something happens to an individual in society and it causes that individual to feel very isolated, very detached from the norms and the behaviors that were previously used to guide their lives, and all of a sudden it leaves an individual feeling very alone, very confused, feeling like the norms of society have let them down, right? So I think anomie and retreatism are a really good parallel to one another to understand that concept. And the last option for strain theory is rebellion. And according to this aspect of strain theory, rebels will replace society's goals and means with their own. So they will strive to overthrow society's goals through socially unacceptable means. So it's this kind of idea that if I can't achieve this goal that I have, I'm going to tear this institution to the ground, and I'm not going to walk away peacefully. I'm going to go kicking and screaming, right? So those are definitions of these 5 different facets of strain theory, but it might still be kind of difficult to really understand what these look like. So I'm going to go ahead and apply them to the example. What happens when a person has a socially acceptable goal? For instance, they want to go to college, but they lack the socially acceptable means to reach that goal. So let's consider, for example, an individual who really wants to go to college, but doesn't have the funds. They don't have the money or the financial aid that they need to actually go to college. What would they do in each of these situations? Well, a conformist would accept that going to college just isn't financially doable at this current time, and they would find a job that only requires a high school degree, right? So instead of doing anything illegal, doing any deviant behaviors, a conformist is just going to do the best that they can, accept that maybe they can't afford to go to college, and that's okay. They're going to have to find a new career path or a new goal to set their focus on. An innovator, on the other hand, would be willing to engage in deviant behavior or in criminal activity even to achieve their goal. So for example, an innovator might cheat on the SAT in school to increase the chances of getting into college, or an innovator might rob a bank to be able to afford college tuition. All right. A ritualist, again, remember these are the individuals who lower their expectations or lower their goals so they become more achievable. So in this context, a ritualist might just take 1 or 2 classes at a community college while working full-time after they graduate high school so they can save up enough money for a 4-year institution a year or 2 down the road. So a ritualist, again, setting a more realistic expectation. Retreatists would probably feel very abandoned by these false promises that they've been fed into, that if they work hard enough in high school that they can get into college, only to find out that maybe they don't have the funds or the aid that they needed. So a retreatist would really retract from society. They would abandon the idea of college and employment altogether, potentially even becoming homeless, entering into depressive cycles, because these expectations that had been built into their ideology of who they were and who they were going to become were taken away from them. And then lastly, the rebellion. The rebellion would become an enemy of the institution of higher education. They would think, if I can't get into this institution, I'm going to tear it down. They might vandalize admissions office of universities around the city. Who knows what a rebellion would do. All right, so just different examples here of how each of these 5 different facets of strain theory would respond to not being able to achieve a certain goal. Let's take a look at conflict theorists now. Unlike functionalists, conflict theorists do not see deviance as a functional aspect of society. Instead, conflict theorists see deviance and crime as evidence of inequality in a society. Like I talked about before, we looked at a lot of those discrepancies, comparing certain percentages of prison populations versus percentages of the US population, and those discrepancies in those percentages, seeing that people of color, for example, are far more likely to be arrested in comparison to white people, or to see that people with lower levels of education are more likely to be incarcerated in comparison to people with higher levels of education, are all evidence to conflict theorists that there are systems of inequality at play here, serving to privilege certain groups of individuals and oppress others. So the power elite are a small group of wealthy and influential people at the top of society who hold power and control of scarce resources, and conflict theorists are going to say that the decisions made by power elite, including deciding what is criminal and what is not, and how to punish criminal acts, affect everyone in society, but particularly people of lower social classes, And again, that intersection of race is very important to recognize as well. So again, crimes are socially constructed, right? We as a society decide what constitutes as a crime, and we as a society also determine what the punishment for those crimes are to be. But specifically, a conflict theorist, again, is always going to consider how people in power manipulate society by using that power to set up society in ways that enable them to ensure that they maintain that power. Because nobody wants to give up the ability to control society, right? And so the power elite definitely fall into that. You know, when laws are passed that decide what acts are criminal and how they're going to be punished, you know, things like the 3 strikes law, that was very heavily influenced by the power elite in society, the people that have money, you know, that can fund politicians and their campaigns to run for election as long as they get a little tit-for-tat negotiation in there, you know. Sure, you know, I'll fund your election next year, but I want to make sure that my private prisons are going to be stable and that they're not going to come under fire. So if you can guarantee me that I'll be able to maintain my private prisons and the funds that I'm getting from them, yeah, I'll contribute $2 million to your campaign next year, you know? So conflict theorists are very leery about the inequalities within the prison system, especially as they contribute to this kind of prison for profit formula that's associated with the privatization of prisons. While crime is often associated with underprivileged people, wealthy people also commit crimes. They're just less likely to be charged, and when they are, they often face lesser sentences. A great example of this is the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s. During this time, crack was much cheaper and more commonly used by people of lower socioeconomic status, but in comparison, pure cocaine was very expensive and more commonly used as a party drug by wealthy people, predominantly by white people. Interestingly, a possession charge for 50 grams of crack yielded a 10-year prison sentence, but someone would need to be in possession of 5,000 grams of cocaine to get that same sentence. So again, crack was predominantly associated with people of lower socioeconomic status, especially people of color. Cocaine, far more likely to be used by wealthier people, was far more expensive to obtain, and it was predominantly therefore used by white people given the intersections of socioeconomic status and race in our society. But look, you needed to have 5,000 grams of cocaine to get the same prison sentence as crack, which is just another way of showing how people in power use their power to manipulate these systems to privilege them, right? Likely, a lot of these wealthy, upper-class, white politicians were doing cocaine, and they wanted to make sure that their asses were covered if they ever got arrested or found that they were in possession of cocaine. So they were able to manipulate the laws to ensure that the sentencing rates were far less severe for cocaine in comparison to crack, right? While the power elite makes the rules that govern society, they can also break the rules. Think of all the time wealthy celebrities or politicians broke the law and got away with it, just a slap on the wrist. For example, good old Justin Bieber got in a lot of trouble a few years ago, but no matter how ridiculous the crimes were, no matter how many times he was arrested, he kept getting away with just, you know, maybe a night in jail and then paying a fine the next day. Whereas if this would have been a lower class person or a person of color, the odds of them getting more severe punishments for this are definitely likely. So lastly, let's take a look at symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionists, again, are going to focus on how certain behaviors come to be viewed as either deviant or criminal. So how do we as a society label something as deviant, or how do we label something as being criminal, and the distinction between the two? Well, we use what they refer to as labeling theory, which again is another theory that's heavily used in criminology, but is definitely akin to symbolic interactionism. So labeling theory is an extension of symbolic interactionism that suggests that the labels people are given affect their own and other perceptions of them, thus channeling their behavior into other deviance or conformity. So for example, how do you think your pursuit for college education would be different if you were labeled as a dumb child or student rather than a smart child or student throughout your adolescence? So labeling goes both ways. If you get positive labels when you're young, you know, being told you're so bright, you're so driven, you're going to do great, studies actually show that people that are positively labeled like that develop higher senses of self-worth and actually perform better in comparison to students that are labeled as being dumb or untalented, etc. The labels that people in society place on us hold great power over the way we are treated and the opportunities we have to succeed, whether negative or positive. Suppose you got caught smoking weed as an adult and got charged with a crime. For the rest of your life, you would carry the label of criminal. Think of how this would affect you. We talked about this in the last presentation. And it doesn't matter if we associate with the label or not. All that matters is